Welcome back to another edition of This Week in 3 Minutes. I've called this one Buckle Up. And it's not just because of the markets. We'll get there in a minute. So gold right now, holding firm, 1350 US, somewhere around that range. It's Thursday night, which is about 1690 and change in Canadian dollars. So 1700 is kind of a key emotional number for us here in Canada, and it's only $100 away from the peak in 2011. So that's exciting. Yeah, so speaking of the markets, this dead cat bounce, I mean, the 10% decline we saw, over the last week and change, we're seeing it come back up, but it's running out of steam as if it just doesn't have any more energy to keep going up. It can't even hit 50% of the decline. So we'll see, but I just found out literally seconds ago that the Fed may be back with quantitative easing. It seems that the Fed has pumped $11 billion into the banks, which leveraged up gives the banks about $110 billion worth of play money. So we'll see what happens with the markets tomorrow, whether this is going to be enough. I have no idea if it's going to be enough or what it's going to be able to do, but we're going to watch. And what else we've been looking at, I think this has to do with a chart we saw last week where banks had stopped lending to each other, basically frozen. The credit markets were nearly frozen, which was what led to the last financial crisis. So the Fed obviously is reacting to that. Whether it's enough remains to be seen. The 10-year Treasury, the yield on the 10-year Treasury has gone bonkers. I didn't realize this. I knew it was up 17% month over month, but if you don't know about what the U.S. Treasury yield means to the rest of the markets, it means big trouble when it's rising. And if you go back to September of last year, we've seen a 33% increase in the yields on the 10-year Treasury. That's going to cause havoc. If we break through 3% on those instruments, I think there's going to be some real volatility. Okay, what else we got going on? Oh yes, the march away from the U.S. dollar is continuing. I just found out today the Russians, now in addition to the Chinese, have launched their own way to move money around the world, their own trade settlement system called MIR. It's just more walking away from the U.S. Speaking of walking away from the U.S. dollar, the U.S. dollar would have been made worthless if the oil arrangement had been set up with the Saudis in the 70s, where the OPEC nations only sold in U.S. dollar terms, basically funding the U.S. government through this petrodollar carry trade. So I want you to mark in your calendars, March 26th of this year, the Petro-Yuan oil futures contract goes live. This is the first major coup against this OPEC petrodollar arrangement that's been in place for the last 40 years. And I don't know what the fallout's going to be, but it's going to be continued decline in the use of the U.S. dollar and more volatility for any U.S. dollar-denominated instruments. So what does this relate with crashes and seatbelts and all that? I couldn't help but remember stories my father said about different car manufacturers back in the 50s and 60s and the implementation of seatbelts and technology and markets being ready for it or not ready for it. I didn't know this, but seatbelts were actually made law in the late 50s, early 60s somewhere, where manufacturers were forced to put seatbelts in vehicles. Just like the top banking regulators saying you need to improve your balance sheets and get something that's a safety net, and adding gold as a zero risk weighted asset is much like the manufacturers in putting seatbelts in cars. Problem is the retail regulators, which were equivalent to the local traffic police officers, they weren't able to enforce it until 1976. So we're not there yet with the retail regulators telling the investment crowd to own gold, but it's coming, it's going to get regulated, and it's going to get policed. But I think we're going to have an nasty crash before then. And so the only way you can hope to protect yourself in a vehicle with a seatbelt is to wear the bloody seatbelt. Buckle up, because it's no good to you after the accident. And I'll leave you with a funny quote I heard today. Gold is like Bitcoin for people who don't tweet. I thought that was quite clever. Anyways, on that note, have a fantastic weekend, and we'll see you next Friday.